So, John, you start your piece off, and I think it's an important piece because the left really has, it seems to me, largely an undefinable, in many respects, a very defensive position when it comes to immigration in this country. We keep hearing comprehensive immigration reform. Nobody seems to. I think your average person does not necessarily know what that means, when the rubber meets the road. And one of the things that the left is accused of is an open borders policy. And I think there is sort of some type of, largely, it depends on where on the left people are situated. There is a knee-jerk reaction to be nervous about that for some reason. We will get to that, but let's just start with you cite the story of Sir Cyril Radcliffe as a way of explicating the failure of borders in our modern era. Tell us about that.
Right. Yeah. So Sir Cyril Radcliffe, he was the English lawyer who was nearly single-handedly charged with drawing the borderline between Pakistan and India when the British Empire was backing out of South Asia. And he had just a few weeks to draw this line. It's incredibly complicated. He tried to follow a little bit of the National Geographic makeup of the area, but also he had to take into considerable account the very complex religious, cultural, ethnic divisions and history. And he had never been to India before, and in a couple of weeks he basically did his best, but in the end it was slapdash, and he divided India from East and West Pakistan, and East Pakistan now Bangladesh. And almost immediately there was intense violence, and there's massive migration to get to the other side of the lines that he drew. It was a very complex system of enclave within enclave, and even a couple times within enclave, where there was tiny parts of the countries in little islands in the other country, and it was a complete mess. And I think that this is one of many examples throughout the world that we can point to as being an arbitrary and nothing natural about it formation of borders. And we now see this argument a lot in this country, contemporary, saying like, well, if we don't have borders, we don't have a country. But we're like talking about open borders isn't necessarily abolishing a border. Those are two different terms, and I think defining lots of these terms is really important. But one is the second part of that argument, second hole in that argument, is that it's simply ahistorical. We haven't had enforced militarized borders in this country as recently as about 30 years ago. I mean, you go a little bit further back and to the early 20th century, and we had almost zero infrastructure at all along any of the U.S. geographic borders. So I think. All right. So I just want to be clear on that dynamic. Yeah. And
it sounds a little bit remedial, but I think people should understand this. There is value, at least in terms of, let's say, jurisdiction for law, or property ownership, or you can't light off fireworks, whatever it is. In the context of border, because we got to understand like who is responsible for this, which town is responsible. That's why we have borders between towns, and borders between states, but they are open borders. I mean, so the states exist without a militarized border. There's no reason why a nation can't. And your point is, it is certainly it's been the case that our borders have been written and enforced insofar as it provides jurisdiction. But in terms of there being a military or militarized or a wall or checkpoints or stuff like that, not so much.
Right. That's a point that I think is a good one to make, is the analogy of the United States versus, an international border. So we have borders between all of our states, and people can cross them freely. And, they have to then abide by the laws in the new state, and the laws are different. But we don't see mass migration across different states, even when there are pretty significant differences in income inequality, for example. And so, militarizing the border or demilitarizing the border won't necessarily result in a massive influx of people, which I think is driving a lot of the scare right now. And that's one point. The other point is, right now, with the status quo, which is a militarized border, we are having a large increase a large influx of migrants. It's not historically large, but it is still significant. And so the border doesn't really work. So you can try to establish these concrete barriers, but people are going to get around. So the real question, I think, should be, when people come, because they will come, how do we integrate them? How do we do so in a humane way? Or how do we help create societies on both sides of the border that have access to opportunity and justice? And there, I think, is a conversation that we're entirely skipping when we only concentrate on the border.
We talk, and really, I mean, we're skipping sort of, I guess, the conversation about immigrants. I mean, of the estimates of how many undocumented folks there are in this country, and I've seen anywhere from 10 to 20 million undocumented folks. Everyone agrees that half of that number, whatever it is, 10 or 20, half of it are people who just who came here legally, just overstayed their visas. So the border is irrelevant in that conversation as well.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that one thing we need to emphasize is that any sort of policy that we're enacting is going to be, we need to extend some sort of humanity towards people who are either caught up in our immigration system and people who are here. And I think that the most humane way to do that is to look at the reality of what's going on, that people are coming, and there will continue to come as long as there's gross disparities in income and there's, climate change bearing down on especially the global south. And if we don't take into consideration how to accept these people or how to help them as as fellow human beings deal with the travesties that they're dealing with, just trying to wall them out isn't going to make anyone safer or anyone have a happier life, because it doesn't work. And we've seen that throughout history.
Well, all right, let's take a break. When we come back, let's talk about and I think we've touched on the ethical, although I think there's more to be said from an ethical standpoint. But Absolutely. There's also environmental reasons to have open border. There's also economic arguments for open borders that we should touch on. So let's take a quick break. I will be right back. Ring of Fire Radio. We'll be talking to John Washington about his piece, What Would an Open Borders World Actually Look Like? We'll be right back after this.